Public Affairs. Welcome to our special event today on the crisis in Afghanistan. Of course, this is also our part of our Watson Distinguished Speaker Series. I am delighted, truly delighted today to welcome our distinguished speaker, Ambassador Ron Neumann. Ambassador Neumann, as part of his extraordinary career as a U.S. Foreign Service officer, actually his extraordinary career in public service more generally, he served as U.S. Ambassador to Afghanistan from 2005 to 2007. He had served just before that in the U.S. Embassy in Baghdad as the embassy's liaison with the multinational command. Prior to his assignments in Iraq and Afghanistan, Ambassador Neumann had served as U.S. Ambassador to Algeria and also U.S. Ambassador to Bahrain. Among many other roles in his career, he's also served as Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for Near East Affairs. That was in the late 1990s. Ambassador Neumann earned his undergraduate and master's degrees from the University of California, Riverside, and he also served as an Army infantry officer in the Vietnam War. He's currently president of the American Academy of Diplomacy. Today's event is actually going to be held, as you can see, in a discussion format with our own Brian Atwood serving as interviewer. For the probably very few of you in this room who don't know Brian already, or the few of you who haven't had the benefit of taking courses from him, let me just say Brian has served as a senior fellow and visiting scholar at Watson since 2016, I believe. But that came after, not unlike Ambassador Neumann, for Brian, an absolutely distinguished and outstanding career in public service and diplomacy and education. Among many other accomplishments, Brian served as the director of the U.S. Agency for International Development, USAID, during the Clinton administration, and prior to that had served as Undersecretary of State for Management. Brian also served as Assistant Secretary of State for Congressional Relations during the Carter administration. And as many of you know, he had also served in his career as Dean of the University of Minnesota's Hubert Humphrey School of Public Affairs. With that, Brian, I'm going to turn it over to you and to Ambassador Ron Neumann, but please join me in welcoming Brian.
Thank you very, very much, Ed, and it's a pleasure to be back here, especially on a beautiful fall day and with such a great audience, and including the ones that are going to be looking at this over YouTube. But I'm really delighted that Ambassador Neumann chose to come here. I twisted his arm a bit. He forced me to go to the University of North Carolina a few weeks ago, so I figured, well, maybe I had a chance of getting him here, and I'm delighted. One thing that Ed did not mention were the two books that Ambassador Neumann has authored. And I'll mention their titles because I think they say it all and needn't say anything much more. His memoir is called 3 Embassies and 4 Wars. So if you can probably think a little bit about the places where he's served. He's also served in addition to the Middle East, in Iran, as well as in Dakar, Senegal, one of my favorite African capitals. But the other book is called The Other War, Winning and Losing in Afghanistan. So he certainly is well qualified to talk about what is on a lot of people's minds. And I hope today we can not only talk about the things that have been in the news in recent weeks, but also get into the history a bit of Afghanistan and try to sort out the lessons learned for the United States, for the international community, maybe for NATO, since they were involved in this as well. Maybe even going back to a book that some of you may have read, which turned into a movie called Charlie Wilson's War. Fascinating movie. I happen to know most of the characters in real life, and I can tell you that Tom Hanks underplayed Charlie Wilson in that movie.
I remember. Yeah, but he's better looking.
I first met Ron Neumann when he was Deputy Assistant Secretary in the Near East Bureau, and I was in the Congressional Relations Bureau. And you can imagine we had a lot to talk about at the time, given Congress's involvement in foreign policy. But I want to start, Ron, if you don't mind, you were in Afghanistan as late as July of this year. You came back, you wrote an article for the Washington Post. That article has been distributed here, so a lot of you have had a chance to read it. But given what we now know in terms of the way it all sorted out, could you just talk a bit about what you saw? I'm sure you visited with a lot of old friends and talked to a lot of people, but what you saw in July and whether or not you picked up some signals that maybe this was going to turn out badly.
Well, thank you. Am I on? Yeah. Uh, Maybe I should sort of go back and say that Afghanistan has been a little bit, for me, a little bit like malaria. You know, it's not necessarily good for you, but it gets in the blood. My father was ambassador to Afghanistan. I first went there in 1967. I traveled all over the country with my wife in those days. We drove all the way through the center of Afghanistan. I went to the hunting party up into the far northeast where I went by jeep and then of course yacht along the Amazon. And I went back in 2005 as ambassador. I started going back in 2010 because I stayed involved writing and speaking, and I feel that if you're going to do that, you have a requirement to update yourself. And I didn't go back till 2010 because it's sort of bad form to show up in your successor's footsteps as before he's basically got the seat warm. But I started going back in 2010. I was back every year, sometimes more than once. Had worked, actually, General Miller, last commanding general, had me out with a team looking at Afghan local police program in 2012, where we went to little special forces camps and we divided up. I went to Helmand, Zabul, and Kandahar, visiting special forces groups and looking at this program. And then I hadn't been back in 2019 with a medical issue. 2020 had blocked things with COVID. And so I felt a need to get back and sort of metaphorically kick the tires. And that was why I went. And because I have a lot of contacts, the Afghan government gave me a car and a secure driver. And so I saw a lot. I saw a lot of people. I saw President Ghani. I saw President Abdullah. I saw the Interior Minister. I saw politicians and journalists. I talked to television people. I saw the UN group, which were doing excellent reporting, by the way. Saw our ambassador. I saw General Miller the last night he was in Kabul before he got on a plane. And I looked at it with, some expectations and some things to learn and some knowledge of Afghanistan and some knowledge of insurgencies. And this was clearly not good. I mean, you didn't have to go to Afghanistan to find out it was not good. It had been going bad for some time for a lot of reasons. But a couple of provincial cities had begun to fall. And what I saw was something that I thought was very dire, but that still had some potential. I thought it was very clear that this was not about the numbers of soldiers. This was about the morale of the Afghan army. And the decline in the morale of the Afghan army began particularly in the Trump administration with the signing of the peace agreement. We can go into that if you want. The sense that America was no longer backing us. And if America's not going to back us, we can fight, but where are we going? Particularly because, remember, the Taliban continued to enjoy sanctuaries in Pakistan, so they weren't losing their external backing. But then when President Biden made the decision to pull everybody out, I think this had both a practical and a morale effect. The practical has been talked about a great deal. One of the reasons for the sort of extra morale effect, I think, was that it was pretty well known that all the advice President Biden was getting was to stay. He made a big deal out of consulting with the NATO allies. Trump doesn't consult, we're back, we're going to consult. NATO allies told him to stay. And it's a funny world where the Germans and the Italians are more eager to stay in a war than the Americans. But that was the advice he got from NATO, and he blew it off. It was also the position of the review mandated by Congress done by the U.S. Institute of Peace, which involved both former Chairman General Dunford, former National Security Director Steve Hadley. The advice of that report also was to stay with a small number. And this was all well known, and so I think it left people perhaps sort of unassumed expectation that the decision would be to stay. And so there was a degree of shock factor, which perhaps there shouldn't have been because Biden's position on this has been well known for some time. And then you had the fact that really in some ways much worse, the 25, really 3,500 troops were the least important piece of the pullout. The really two critical pieces were the air support and the 15,000 contractors that were key to maintaining the Afghan Air Force, the Afghan supply system. And remember, this isn't just an Afghan problem. This is a structure we built. And we built a structure modeled on ours, for some fairly good reasons, actually, but which required this kind of support. And by the way, we hadn't been working on it for 20 years. We hadn't even decided to build an Air Force until 2010. And then we frightfully screwed it up for a while, including spending 450 something million on transport planes that we eventually decided were worthless and junked for 46 million. There's not all the Afghans. Part of it's the Afghans, a lot of corruption, other things. But I go into this because you had this combination of hugely undercutting their ability to fight. And this is like you practice to be a baseball player all your life, and they tell them, by the way, this time you got to pitch left-handed. It's not going to work. And so you began to see this. So I came out of this, I said, look, in the article, which you all read, so you can keep me honest, that there's a morale problem, and a part of the morale problem is the lack of belief that the United States will back them. So remember, President Biden's policy, as he declared it in the speech, was that we're leaving militarily, pulling our troops out, but we will continue to support the Afghan forces. Key piece of the lack of the morale collapse was people did not believe that part. And in fact, one of the things I was told in Kabul by several different people were that there were rumors or questions, is it true the Americans have really changed sides and they're backing the Taliban and the Pakistanis? And this was all over Kabul. There was the degree to which they doubted at the kind of street level our support. And that was why one of the things I said in the article was that we needed to do things, very visible, big symbolic things to show that there was a reality to our support. If we'd done it, I don't know whether it would have worked. Maybe it wouldn't have been, maybe it was already too little too late. But we didn't do it, so I don't know. Second thing was there was a spontaneous resistance to the Taliban that was cropping up in various places. That was something I had not known much about. I was skeptical. I had to ask several different people. I talked to people who, had their relatives right on the ground in Herat or in Talak. And so I had a fair high degree of detail and corroboration. And I said, that needs to be supported. Well, we didn't support it, and there were reasons actually it would have been very difficult for us to support it. The Afghan government didn't do it effectively. And then the last thing I said in the article, because I said, look, Afghan history has generally not, the wars have not ended with a climactic battle. They end when one side looks around and decides, this is done. There's nothing here to die for. And then you quit. And you can have a very heavy, it's not that Afghans are cowardly, you can have very heavy fighting leading up to that. But when you get to that point, you quit. I remember talking, I'm sorry, such a long answer to your question, but I wanted to give you the sense of context. I remember at one point sitting up talking to a police commander up in the Conchacai Dam in Helmand about the Afghan local police program. And I asked him, what are you going to do if this program doesn't work? And he said, I'll surrender. And he said, because you have to understand, if I just put my gun down and go back to my village, they'll hunt me down. We have blood debts. We've killed each other. But if I surrender, weapon in hand, unit form, that's honorable, and they'll leave me alone. And this was in my mind. And so I said, if the cities go, this could all go very, very quickly. And then I think I had in the article, this could be a very messy evacuation. And in fact, one of the things was in my mind was Afghan friends had told me when the Taliban came to Kabul, the same deal. They moved very quickly, very little fighting. Things just crumbled. And one friend had told, I remember saying that he'd gone to sleep at night and been told the Taliban were 30 kilometers outside Kabul, and woke up in the morning to find the Taliban were in the street. So this was history repeating itself. Now, I didn't say it's going to happen in 2 weeks, but I said it could go very, very quickly. I don't think that was ever internalized by us.
Well,
Sorry, that was an
clear
awful
that
long answer.
It's clear that the intelligence agencies of the United States hadn't read your article or didn't take it seriously, I guess, but they obviously missed some signals here. And meanwhile, you've got Ambassador Khalilzad, who was an ambassador. Well, he's been ambassador to Afghanistan, been ambassador to Iraq. He was the Trump's person to negotiate the so-called peace deal. He's talking to Baradar, who ends up being the number 2 in the current Taliban government in Doha. And they are expressing mutual concern about what chaos would happen in Kabul if this thing happened too quickly. And there were negotiations. The problem, at least according to Khalilzad, is that President Ghani wasn't willing to negotiate directly with the Taliban, or seemed unwilling to accept the possibility that he wouldn't be the person in power. And so he held back a lot, and that created the vacuum, it seems to me. And then, of course, at the last minute, he leaves Kabul. All of that is part of the history that has to be explained more fully, I guess, as we move along, and perhaps have hearings with Khalilzad. He's already had a long interview in Foreign Policy magazine. If you want to read that, it's an interesting lessons learned kind of thing. But it seemed to me that Baradar was expressing the same kinds of concern, that Kabul would turn into a chaotic mess and that they would inherit a mess. And that didn't happen in the end. What weight do you put on this conversation that apparently Khalilzad had with Baradar?
Well, I'm sure they had it. Nobody has ever accused Ambassador Khalilzad of reporting everything he does.
Yeah, that's a milder statement than you made to me in the car on the way over.
Well, we're in public here. In any event, Khalilzad reports that General McKenzie said to Baradar, I have my mission. And Baradar said, you, the Americans, if you don't want us to go to Kabul, you need to move into Kabul, and you need to secure Kabul right now. And McKenzie, according to this article, kept saying, I have my mission. Now, if we really, so question 1, did this really happen as reported? Very possibly true. If it did, we lost a significant opportunity to avoid a major disaster and disgrace to the United States and the quality of our evacuation. If we actually had the opportunity to put troops in secure Kabul for a couple of weeks and have a peaceful evacuation without this massive crowd, without having to depend on the Taliban to screen people, I mean, this would have been a very different looking operation. And if we did not do that, then there is a serious fault that should be held accountable for having missed that opportunity. But there is a question, even if that happened. Remember that, that's the first question that has to be answered. Did that happen? Second question, though, is why, if McKenzie did give the answer he gave, did he give it because you have really two logical possibilities. One is a rigid military man who could not look beyond his orders to see an incredible opportunity and blew it for his country. One possibility. Another possibility is a man who knew damn well what was going on, but was constrained by the orders and what he understood the White House wanted and felt no flexibility to respond to that. Totally different. That needs to be asked. You can't make an assumption about the responsibility, because one big question is, why didn't you at least call back for authority to think about it? You can ask to change the mission. And you didn't do it. Why didn't you do it? I don't know. One answer might be, was damn well told by the White House, just do this, don't do anything else, get out. I don't know. But there is a apparently significant failure to take an opportunity, and we do not know if the responsibility for that failure lies with the commanding general on the ground, somewhere in the chain of command, or the President of the United States. And that is worth exploring. But as far as I know, nobody in the hearings yesterday, the day before, bothered to ask.
The third dimension, of course, was the fact that our intelligence was saying that Kabul would hold, that we would have time because the Afghan military would at least hold Kabul to the point where we could have a less messy evacuation. And I'm not sure to what extent the president and his top people basically decided that they must be right. Ghani kept telling them that they were going to hold. And in any case, this is something that has to be reviewed very, very carefully. When the Taliban first came in, they seemed, and Khalilzad also says that he's talked to them about a more diverse government, a government that would have some of the other ethnic groups represented, that may even, I'm not sure they had talked about whether women would be in that government. But they were talking to Karzai, the former president, and they were talking to Abdullah, people that had been in the previous government, but to no avail. They finally formed the government, and it's pure Taliban across the board, which leads me to ask a question about the nature of the Taliban. We hear there were factions, some more moderate, some more. The Haqqani faction was seen as more of a quote unquote terrorist faction. And of course, he's on our terrorist list. The son is now in that government. What is the nature of the Taliban beyond their Islamic extremism? I have to say it, it's extremism. It's not the religion of Islam that I'm familiar with, but what do you think? Are they a nationalist element and caring only about Afghanistan, or are they international terrorists? What's your view? And what's their relationship to the international terrorists like Al-Qaeda and ISIS-K and the other groups?
I want to be very careful in answering this, not to pose as knowing more than I do. And frankly, I think that our level of knowledge nationally about the Taliban is very, very weak. And it has been for 20 years. This has been an intelligence problem, but it's a well-known problem. Partly because Taliban damn good about holding their internal views, their internal discussions internally. So some of what we know about the Taliban is a little like what we know about a black hole. You judge by things that happen around it rather than because you can observe the thing itself. So let me try to give you some short pieces to that different pieces of that question. One is their relations with Al-Qaeda. That we have good evidence those relations are unbroken. They have not changed. Now, in theory, the Taliban have committed not to allow any extremist organization to attack us or our allies. That was part of the Doha Agreement. That means you have to depend on that. They can have close relations with Al-Qaeda, and they can set up rest and recreation in Afghanistan for R&R, but they're not supposed to plan terrorist attacks there. Maybe, not quite convinced of that one. Al-Qaeda has put out enough to know that they still think they're at war with the United States, even if we think we've dropped out. And we know even from the things in bin Laden's computers after they were captured when he was killed, that the Al-Qaeda and bin Laden had a particularly close relationship with the Haqqani movement. There's one place in his computer stuff where he talks about being a little worried about where the Taliban are going vis-a-vis Al-Qaeda, but to instruct someone to go see the Haqqanis because we trust them, they'll give us an honest answer. You have 4 Haqqani ministers in this government. So I would say the potential for terrorism is large, but we'll see. You have a second terrorist operation there with the Islamic State, ISIS, which is clearly an international terrorist threat. And they're still in Afghanistan, but they and the Taliban probably have fought each other and will fight each other. Although there's some question about whether Haqqanis have perhaps facilitated some ISIS terrorist operation. Then you have a half dozen, at least, other terrorist movements, which are based in Afghanistan, the Islamic movement of Uzbekistan, a Uyghur movement against the Chinese, and the Tajik movement. I don't know, everybody's spare terrorist, I think it's Afghanistan. So you have a potential for a certain amount of radiating instability coming out of there, including the Taliban, the Pakistani Taliban, Tehrik-i-Taliban Pakistan, which is an anti-Pakistan movement that causes terrorist operations in Pakistan. So you got a lot of potential, no certainty. Is Al-Qaeda an international movement of international goals? Not as far as we know. There's a lot of stuff coming out now, some of which is bad information because there are a lot of people with a reason to hate them. And so a lot of stuff. I was told the other day that there'd been a statement about, well, our head, our Mullah is it really should be for all Islam. That would be the Sunni equivalent of the Vilayat-e-Faqih in Iran, and that would be a sudden turn to a very expansionist goal. But I don't know if that statement's true, and it may not be. Up to now, everything they've said poses them as a very fundamentalist, conservative Islamic movement throwback to the 7th century, but with national goals, not international. So we'll see if that holds. And then as to factions within, well, we know of one. We know of the split. We know that there is some tension between the Haqqani movement and the core Al-Qaeda movement, and that there was a lot of pulling and tugging, especially after not after Mullah Omar died, but after Mansour was assassinated. And there was a moment where there appeared to almost be a split between the son of Mullah Omar, the founder of the Taliban, and the Haqqani movement. And that was resolved by giving them each a position, and they each have come into government with a position. So the Haqqanis now have the Interior Ministry, and Mullah Yaqub, the son of Mullah Omar, is happens to be the head of the Defense Ministry. So that we see. We see other things that suggest tension, but you can't prove it. So for instance, you had a decree that said no women should report to any of their jobs. The ministries stay home pending a decision on what was going to happen to women at government. Well, the Taliban of '96 would have just said, get out. The fact that you have this saying we're still making a decision, that could be a sop to the West, to the pressure to look more like they're becoming more moderate, but it could also be a sign of tension. There were stories recently that Mullah Baradar, who you had mentioned, was very opposed to the formation of this government that just came out, thought it was too radical, there needed to be more inclusion, and that actually came to blows in their internal meeting. And actually, I know somebody, well, it's a secondhand source who was talking to somebody else who was talking directly to a Barada who was down in Kandahar, who said, yes, that's true. That, if you come to blows in the cabinet meeting, that probably indicates tension. So there are splits, but they have managed up to now, over 20 years of war, they've managed to hold together very well. So I think one can make too much of this. I think what one can say so far is, though, they are everything we are seeing publicly, if you look at direction rather than specific actions, they are rapidly retrogressing to the Taliban we knew before.
Fighting a war in your own country is different than running a government. I'll give a shout out to the cost of war project here at Brown, which estimates that we've spent in the 20 years $2.26 trillion, and make the point that 43% is the figure I saw of the Afghan economy was foreign aid, was aid coming in from the international community. Now you've got a situation where there are food shortages, there's an economic crisis with respect to the banks and their ability to trade, and you've got winter coming. Now the Taliban are facing all of that. The question becomes, do they become even more anxious and more radical, or do they become more susceptible to whatever conditionality the international community might impose? Now, the World Food Program is active there. There are something like over 100 representatives of the International Organization for Migration. International High Commissioner for Human Rights has people there. So the UN is there. And you may recall that in the last time we had a change in government in Afghanistan, the United States used the money that they have in the bank, and I think we've got $6 or $7 billion of Afghanistan's money in the bank right now, and they paid the UN to go in and help them run their ministries. Is it likely that the United Nations has a role to play here, and will it be a role that helps modify and moderates, I should say, the conduct of the Taliban government?
I think there's a strong chance the UN has a large role to play. I do not know if you will see any moderation for the Taliban. There is an immediate problem, which is that the UN and the NGOs are all having trouble paying and engaging their staff because the banking system is frozen, which is something that we have a hand in. So we have an immediate problem. We, the United States, along with international partners, have an immediate problem that we have to figure out how to release money so that if we want the international NGOs, the UN, to be the deliverer of humanitarian relief, we have to enable them to do it. Otherwise, we're going to be splitting responsibility with the Taliban for the depth of the crisis and a lot of people dying of hunger. I think that's not a position we should be in. And I hope we solve it, but right now our decision-making process seems to be constantly outrun by actions in the field. We do not have a decision-making process adequate to the challenge. The UN is already back. They just reopened their office in Mazar. I talked to one of their people the other day who's just about to go back next week, but they're having a huge problem engaging local staff. The dimension, talking to people in the NGO world, the dimensions of the problem may outrun UN capacity. People are talking about a potential need to feed 18 million people. Now, that's a guess, but there is right now, there's not only a need for the UN, there's a huge need for a central coordinating body. You've been engaged in these kind of exercises. You know the absolute centrality of that coordinating hub to keep things pulled together and avoid duplications and all that. The UN is probably the one to play that role, but I am not at all sure they are staffed yet to do it. So you could have a collapse. The problem also is that the famine is now moving into the cities. because of the banking crisis, even the people who have money can't access the money. And so last week, people of some means were selling furniture on the streets of Kabul in order to generate money to buy groceries. So there's a big piece of this problem. UN has to be part of it. The international NGOs are desperate to do more. We have a major lift we have to do to enable this. And we seem to be remarkably incapable of providing any direction or clear answers to the international NGO community. Having just been in a conversation with a bunch of them the other day, they are all just besides themselves with their absolute inability to get leadership, guidance, or direction from the Biden administration.
Yeah,
I mean, these are all people I think who voted big time to, get rid of Trump and make Joe Biden president, and they are beside themselves.
Yeah, an old colleague of ours, Gene Dewey, has been working on this problem and recommending that the Secretary General name a representative to bring the UN agencies together, but also name a czar within the US government that they can make contact with. I just want to get into one more issue, and then I hope we can open it up for questions. There are microphones on either side. And that is the issue of women and girls. And if there is a development, a positive development over the time we've spent all this money, it is that we now have, at least in the cities, educated women. And the real, it's the sad issue of what they face now. I mean, the real question, I guess, is whether they will, they can't unknow what they know, and they obviously can use this education for a purpose. And any society that leaves 50% of their people out is not going to succeed. And you just wonder whether or not someone in that more moderate side of the Taliban leadership will eventually come to that conclusion. There is now social media in Afghanistan. That didn't exist when the Taliban were last in power. So people can communicate with one another. And one wonders, I might say, the Taliban is using social media as well. So it might be a situation wherein they will do something similar to what is done in other authoritarian countries, which is to control it. But having said that, I just want to go back to your tenure back in 05 and 07. The real issue here, at least as we see the debate politically, is whether or not we ever reconcile the mission in Afghanistan. Is it a counterterrorism mission? And this is what, of course, President Biden keeps saying, this is the original purpose of going in the first place, or was it a nation building mission? And to what extent did that mission change when administrations changed, when the parties here changed over the years, over those that 20-year period? Have we ever reconciled that mission? And if we haven't, no wonder we're confused.
We're definitely confused. By my count, but I think this should not be a partisan discussion. It's very important to keep this nonpartisan criticism. By my count, we have had 10 definitions of our mission over the 20 years we've been in Afghanistan. We started with a pure hunt terrorism, no nation building. For those who say you went to build democracy, bull. That was explicitly not the definition of the first Bush administration. It morphed into that. Obama administration explicitly said we're not going to do nation building. And then they got into it. And they had 5 different policies while Obama was in. And first of all, our problem is not that we can't do something and get it done in 20 years. Our problem is we can't keep focus for 2 years. The second problem is the discussion it's about full fallacy. None of the 4 administrations wanted to build democracy as a policy goal. The problem was always, once you were in, how do you get out without leaving complete chaos behind? And maybe in retrospect, people think it would have been just dandy if we waxed Taliban, in 2001 and early 2 and just left and let it go back to civil war, mass starvation, 5 million refugees that were already out of the country, and a lot more people dying in rocket attacks. And we could have said, not our problem. Maybe, not sure the American people would have really thought that was a really cool way to go. But anyway, if you wanted any kind of responsible out, then you had to create something that you could take your hands off of. I mean, that's the fundamental bedrock problem that every administration grappled with and couldn't solve, but that wasn't for lack of trying. So the fundamental problem, and Obama got into this when he went to build a big army, is an army doesn't exist just kind of free floating in the ether. It comes out of and represents the society that gives birth to it. So to have an army, unless you're hiring mercenaries, a la Renaissance in Italy, you have to have a state. It's rooted in something. And to have a state, you have to have a government. And what's more, you probably have to have an economy, even if you can't pay for the whole army. And so the logic of having something in place that you can leave drives this state building. And it's really state building, not nation building. The Afghan nation exists, 25 years of civil war and war against Soviets. Nobody ever fought to secede, to break apart. They may all fight with each other for Kabul. They don't fight to leave. But the state was totally destroyed. So that was the problem. And then I think, no, we didn't reconcile that. Part of that, though, goes back to some problems that I think I've been pondering this, so I shall try a couple of deep thoughts on you here. But I think there's a couple of things that are very fundamentally American that are much deeper than any Afghan problem. One is we really have a problem saying we can't do something. We cannot do something for a long time. We can decide to do something, but we have excruciating difficulty deciding not to do something. And we don't like to say that a problem is too big, that we can't fix it. And that military is worse because they don't see problems, they only see challenges and opportunities. But this is a fundamental problem if you can't reconcile this. And the second thing is we don't bring into our calculation any real understanding of foreign cultures. We make foreign policy without regard to foreigners. We've done it for years. I was reading a book of
Very quotable quote.
I was reading a book of William Colby's, who spent 15 years in and out of Vietnam, CIA director, and he talks there about made in Washington policies that were never going to be accepted by the Vietnamese. The American attitude, this all would have worked if the Vietnamese had only recognized the brilliance of our suggestions and applied them. And so we did that in Afghanistan too. We magnify it then by our insistence on turning over people. So that if you're ever going to have a hope of factoring in local conditions into your policies, you are going to have to build a learning organization that stays on the ground with your senior people. And that means they don't get to come home. I mean, they get to have vacation, but your ambassadors, your generals, they need to be there for, if not the duration, at least a 5-year tour. This 1-year tour, I find it difficult to keep in polite English. It's an annual frontal lobotomy where you lose all coherence. So it's fine to have a criticism that says you don't understand foreigners, that particular culture, but you cannot do it any better unless you break this short tour mentality.
Just reminded of a famous Dean Acheson quote when a very anxious, aggressive Foreign Service officer came into his office and he said, "Don't just do something, sit there." Also reminded of a quote from a former ambassador to Afghanistan who wrote on this issue that Americans have a strategic impatience. And it's true, we're a very impatient people. We want to get something done. And of course, if you're a member of Congress in the House of Representatives, you only have 2 years to get something done. And if you're a president, you may only have 4. And you certainly want to change things as they go along. Please get up to the microphones and ask a question, if you will. Thank you. Please identify yourself before you ask.
Yes, I'm Ashutosh Varshne, Director of the Center for Contemporary South Asia and Professor of Political Science. Thank you for very enlightening reflections. I have 2 questions. One is the relationship between Pakistani Taliban and Afghan Taliban. Now, all that we have read, long years seem to suggest that Pakistani Taliban are anti-Pakistan government, and Pakistani army crushed them, at least in Khyber Pakhtunkhwa and Waziristan, etc., quite successfully. This is what we read. Afghan Taliban got sanctuary in Pakistan. So how do we understand the relationship between the 2 Talibans, Afghan and Pakistan Taliban, and what is its implication for, in the medium to long run, let's say the medium run, long run, who has seen the long run, in the medium run for Pakistan? As of now, it appears to be a great military / strategic victory for Pakistan. Is it in the medium run? So that's question number 1. Question number 2 has to do with India. Now, should India expect an uptick in terrorism as a result of the Taliban victory in Kabul? How do we understand that relationship? The uptick in 1990s terrorism in India was partly because of how India dealt with Kashmir, that there is a domestic origin for that. But there was no doubt there was a symbiotic connection with Pakistan and Afghanistan in the rise of terrorism in India. So it was not simply a domestic issue. It was there was a symbiotic connection. So could you address these 2 issues, given your vast experience and knowledge of Afghanistan?
I don't think we have great texture beyond that. The Pakistanis seem, the government, and particularly the ISI, the intelligence people, seem to believe that they can continue to control the Pakistani element and that they have enough influence over the Afghan Taliban that they can make this, they can essentially ride 2 horses at the same time and not get to a place where they're going on each side of a tree. I am not entirely convinced this is going to work. I think there are a lot of reasons to believe the Pakistani relationship with the Afghan Taliban is going to be difficult. If for no other reason than the Afghan Taliban have been telling everybody in sundry that they wanted out from under the oppressive hand of Pakistani ISI. And I know plenty of people who have dealt with the Taliban and been hearing that for years. So, Baradar, to the extent that he's still in power, spent several years in a Pakistani jail. It can't be all that much love lost. So I think what the Pakistanis, they don't believe, they think they can make this work. I think they are going to find that they have cultivated a monster and that it will come back to bite them. But that's an argument that American officials have been having with Pakistani officials for many years and have never noticeably made any impact in convincing them that they were wrong to do this. There have been a couple of recent small Pakistani Taliban attacks inside Pakistan, as I understand it. So, problem with all these movements is you never crush them completely. They have the ability to recreate. This is a fundamental American policy problem because we are stuck mentally with the definition of victory that goes back to World War II. Surrender on the decks of the Missouri. You cannot have that form of victory when you fight a transnational movement that has regenerative capability. So if that is your only definition of victory, then the United States and its policymakers and its military leaders have defined a vision in which we must, by definition, fail in every competition militarily with a transnational movement of this kind. So there's going to be, it has to be a search for what is a sufficiency rather than this artificial standard of victory. And I think Pakistan is going to have the same problem. They have not, they have suppressed the Tehrik-e-Taliban Pakistan. They have not crushed it. It has a regenerative capability. As to the Indian piece, God only knows. I do not know. I mean, depending on the nature of Indian-Pakistani relations, the Pakistanis may well go back to using war terrorism as a tool of policy, as they have before. Afghanistan's role was primarily as a convenient location to have people train in a deniable fashion. It's not a, but that doesn't, the absence of that location for the last 20 years of our warfare didn't prevent the Pakistanis from being invested in the Mumbai attacks. So I think whether or not you get more Pakistani terrorism with India will be much more a function of the rest of their relations than it will be specifically about Afghanistan.
Any other questions? I would also add to this that obviously the ISI and the Pakistanis were becoming very concerned about the extent to which the Indians were helping the Afghan government and felt surrounded, and that was one of their motives. But at some point, I'm going to let you in a minute, we got to talk about Iran, we got to talk about China and the Uyghurs in particular.
When
and
do we do the breakfast order?
I know. I mean, there are some geopolitical issues here that, anyway, please. Go ahead.
Like over the next 1 to 3 years.
Good. Follow up to my.
Okay, easy to
Good
talk about, but not easy to be very certain about it. The Chinese have one or two clear priorities. One is the suppression of the Uyghurs. They do not want a Uyghur insurgency movement coming out of Afghanistan, of which there have been bits and pieces. They will unquestionably work with the Taliban. I think, unquestionably, I'm reasonably sure they will work, if they can, with the Taliban to keep that suppressed, because they're very clear about what their lead issue is. Their second priority is to maintain their relationship with Pakistan. Right now, those two don't seem to be in any particular conflict. If the Taliban cannot prevent the Uyghurs from growing an insurgency in Afghanistan, and the Taliban are being protected by Pakistan, then you could have a situation in the future in which the Chinese interests in Pakistan and the interests in working with the Afghans begin to come apart, but not yet. Iran has a long history with the Taliban. They were very opposed to them. Taliban are basically fundamentalist Sunnis. They have massacred Shia Hazaras. They had killed Iranian diplomats in Mazar in the past. The Iranians were quite helpful to, were anti-Taliban, and they were helpful to us when we went in. They were helpful in the invasion. They continued to deal with us. I think I had the last conversation with the Iranian official conversation with the Iranian ambassador in Kabul. We were still meeting in 2005 under UN auspices. And I thought it was a good idea because they were very interested in stability. It was very different from Iran's relations with Iraq. It's useful to contrast that a little bit because Iran views Iraq as a strategic threat. It has been a strategic threat since the Battle of Karbala. And the Iranian activities in Iraq were very, very strong in the 2004, 2005 period. Having been on the receiving end of some of that, I have some appreciation of that. What they were doing in Afghanistan has never been anything like that. For them, Afghanistan is not a strategic, has not been a strategic threat historically. So Iran is much more transactional in Afghanistan. It did not like the Taliban. They were a danger, and they were so the Iranians were helpful to us. They were helpful in stability. They were nervous about what we would do. They didn't like it when the troops got up on the border, Iran and Islam Kala and places, but overall they were helpful. I thought it was a mistake when we stopped those conversations, which I thought could be contained within an Afghan-only context. I argued with Secretary Condoleezza Rice about that decision. I lost. Now the context is different. Iran began, as much as one could tell, several years ago to see that the United States was failing in Afghanistan. Not so much that the war was going to be lost, but our will was failing. And we were going to pull out. The Iranians are practical folk. I spent 3 years there. There's an ideological element to policy, unquestionably, but they're very practical about this. And so as it became apparent that the United States was going to fail, or that there was a potential for failure, I don't think they reached a conclusion, but a potential for failure, they began to warm up their relations with the Taliban. And they have progressively warmed up their relations with the Taliban, even as they maintain reasonably decent relations with the Ghani government. There have been some weapons going from Iran into the Taliban, but it's never been clear whether that was official. It's a fairly porous border. If the Iranians could really control that border, they would be able to stop the weapons going into the Baluchi insurgents in Iran, which they can't do. So you can't really tell, but all I can tell you is there's never been any kind of weapons flow remotely similar to what they put into Iraq when they wanted to destabilize things. And I can give you chapter and verse on weapons type. The other thing, so that they have warmed up their relations. Now, recently, they are beginning to show some signs of nervousness. There are reports that the Iranians are displacing Hazaras or Shia in Daikundi province in Afghanistan. Now, is that anti-Shia or is that an outgrowth of land disputes going back to nomadic herders? In Afghanistan, anything with land is not new. But there are reports of that. There are reports of discrimination. There are some reports that the Iranians are putting weapons into the Hazara area, or were putting weapons into the Hazara areas. So I would say what you have now is a somewhat tense relationship. It's a relationship in which you have surface level cooperation. The Iranians will deal. They will not overtly try to undermine the Taliban, but they are very conscious of both how the Taliban treat Shia, of what this means in terms of future refugee flows into Iran, which they don't want. And so it's a fragile relationship which could become much tenser and produce violence, that will probably depend heavily on whether the Taliban mismanages it. If the Taliban doesn't overplay its hand on bearing down on the Hazaras, the Shia, getting into arguments with Iran and things like that, I don't think the Iranians will make trouble, but they have the potential. I wish there were questions to which there were nice, simple answers.
Other questions over here?
I know people have classes. Please, ma'am.
There's one here.
Use the mic, please.
Oh, I'll.
Okay, thank you.
Oh, yeah, we stole that mic, sorry. Sorry, I've got that mic.
Oh, hello. Okay. This is my name, Tasfia, for those visual people. So we're talking about Iran. We're talking about Shiism and Shiites. Shiism, as some may know, and for those who don't know, is the version of Islam that says that the leaders or the rulers of Islam shall be the descendants of the Prophet Muhammad. On the contrast, Sunnis believe that the leaders of Islam shall be good leaders. So I have two questions. My first is the version of Islam that the Taliban conceptualizes, I'm gonna take this off, it'll be easier to speak.
Like,
Is the version of Islam that the Taliban conceptualizes similar to the version of Islam that Saudi Arabia follows, Wahhabism, which is a type of Islam that is extremely conservative, that the rest of the Islamic world doesn't necessarily adhere to? That's my first question. My second question is, right now in Afghanistan, there's a lot of dark and sad, hopeless things happening. From your point of view, is there anything hopeful? Anything good at all? Thanks.
On the question of Taliban, what you have is a mixture of Hanafi jurisprudence, which is the same Sunni school followed by Saudi Arabia, but with an admixture of Pashtunwali, that is local Pashtun culture. A great deal of what the Taliban do is a matter of their interpretation and this kind of Pashtunwali. So in the one sense, you could say, yeah, they're, the basic school they espouse is the same, but Saudi Arabia just let women start driving, and King Abdullah created a separate university for women, and King Fahd created universities before that, and the Taliban are telling women to go home. So I don't think you can say that these two things look alike, although they have. And actually, one of the, it's probably going to get too detailed, but one of the arguments when they still had some vestige of negotiation was when the Taliban said that Islam has to be the arbiter of the Constitution. And the question was raised, well, okay, and you say it's Hanafi Islam, but will you allow others like Saudi imams Saudi religious leaders to give an interpretation of Hanafi Islam as well as yours? The answer was no. And so what you have with the Taliban is a kind of, to be pejorative, a primitive admixture. I remember President Karzai saying to me once when he was talking about popular pressure, someday I may have institutions, and today I have to worry about an illiterate mullah in a mud mosque. So it's very different. On the second question, is there anything positive? Maybe. Right now there is damn little. There is one positive it's a negative, and then there's one positive, which may only prove that hope springs eternal. There is, at far as I can see, far less killing and hunting down of people than one might have anticipated in the very early days of a revolutionary takeover. I mean, if you look at Iran or the Russian Revolution, or half a dozen others, or Cambodia or Vietnam, you had a lot more killing and imprisonment than so far is happening in Afghanistan. A lot of stories about Taliban going to people's houses and looking for them, and I can't tell you how many appeals I get for people who wish I could help them and I can't, and are talking about this stuff, but they're not really getting many arrests. There are not many people getting picked up. I've had a few stories of people being killed, but not a lot, not more than maybe kind of people acting on their own. That could change tomorrow, but so far it doesn't appear to be a policy. And the Taliban back pressure against people being able to leave seems to represent some indication that they know they need a educated cadre to run the state. But that's a kind of surmise. Those things are transitory. They're very thin to put a base on. The other thing that I find more positive in a way, but it may just speak to the fact that I've been involved in Afghanistan a long time, that maybe my own feelings are tied up in this kind of thing, that you have to be careful. We and Afghans and international partners have laid an awful lot of seeds out there. There are a lot of educated people. There are a lot of Afghans who have taken real risks to be journalists, or to be lawyers, or to be women judges. And I don't think all that goes away. It goes underground. A lot of them will leave. So I hold a kind of hope that some of these seeds can sprout in the future. But that's a hope. It's not based, it's based on knowledge that the seeds are there, but not much ability to fertilize or water them.
Might just add to that, that there are a lot of American organizations and others from around the world that would like to see more people leave, want to evacuate more people. I'm on the board of an NGO that just got about 80 people out on a bus to Pakistan. And there are still people wanting to do charter flights and the rest. And of course, these people that are leaving are the cream of the crop in terms of educated people in Afghanistan. So in a way, it's a two-edged sword. We obviously don't want to see these people ostracized or even killed by the Taliban. And there's a lot of real nervousness about that. But if they continue to behave, it may be better for some of these people to stay and build their country, maybe clandestinely for a while. I'm not sure. Anyway, please.
Thank you. Adam Levine, I'm at the Center for Human Rights, and so not an easy, I apologize in advance. In retrospect, as you laid out, and not just in many of our allies around the world who joined with good fights after Afghanistan. I can say with probably some certainty that there will be a time in the not so distant future when we also have a new country that we want to invade. We have a sense of based on fact future, and really be considering before making that decision to use military force in order to suppress another country.
Well, it's a better question than there probably is an answer, but there are a few things. Now, One is very basic. If you actually look at responsibility, the doctrine under responsibility to protect, which I'm sure given your role you do, you know, the basic foundational argument of R2P is you have to look and say, can you be better when you've acted than you were if you don't act? That does not tend to be, that has not actually been a point of analysis in decision making. I don't think that's so much true of Afghanistan. I mean, Afghanistan we went to because 3,000 Americans died in the Twin Towers. I have no apology for our having gone to war in Afghanistan. And I think to assume that one could have known somehow that it would have been difficult or bad or worse, and presume that you could have said to the American people, well, it's too bad we lost 3,000 people, but we're not going to go after these guys. I don't think that holds water. But we didn't, Afghanistan is actually a bad template to be the basis for the question. Libya would be a much better one, because we didn't go to Afghanistan with a humanitarian motive. We developed one afterwards as we tried to figure out how do we get out. There is one thing which I have not seen the American government do in any of our interventions, which is to ask really hard questions about how is this going to end, and therefore what resources do you need in order to bring that end about? And if that end is not in your power, what are you going to do instead? And the political reality, at least of America, but maybe other places, is that people don't want to answer that question. And I'm pretty sure of my facts in saying that during the Obama deliberations over 6 months for the second policy review, the military initially came in and said, well, for what you're sketching out, we need 10 years, whatever it was, 100,000 troops. And the answer was, well, you don't have that much time. Go tell us how to do this in less time. There was no willingness in the Obama administration to say, if this cannot be done in this time, we should not do it. And there was a lot of resentment about how the military was posing the question of it. But I've never seen us really do a realistic putting means to ends and the timeline. We're just incredibly unrealistic about our timelines, and we're not interested in talking about it. So Obama's timelines were absolutely fatal to the project. And I'm very bipartisan in my criticism. I think Trump made a lousy peace deal and it totally wiped out the Afghan morale. But I think Obama laid the seeds of that. What kind of war do you fight when you say, I'm really coming after you, but if you survive for a year and a half, I'll be out of here? That's leadership? I don't think so. One really fundamental problem of these wars is that, with the possible exception of President Bush, none of the presidents who, as commander-in-chief, put our troops into the war really took ownership of these wars. They didn't sell them to the American people. They did not make any sustained effort to explain the logic of them. They did not deal with the contradictions in the logic they did explain. So yeah, Obama made a couple of speeches. He did not use the bully pulpit to sell the American people on the utility of the war.
Which President Bush are you referring to?
I'm sorry, the second, 43, the second Bush. First Bush didn't have to do this war. I mean, he did sell the Iraq War, the first Iraq War, very strongly, and people understood why we were going to war.
Yeah.
President Bush did not really sell the Afghan war. In fact, probably could have funded it a lot better if he told people to buy war bonds instead of going to the mall. But the point is, none of the presidents, Bush, Obama, or Trump, owned the war. and sold it to the American people, and therefore generated the support and the reserves to do what was necessary. It was a constant effort to sort of handle it on the back burner. And that, when it went up and down, I mean, you know, my period, the reason I called it the other war in my book was because the war became Iraq. And, you know, so 2005, I wanted $600 billion because I wanted to work particularly in the north of Afghanistan, where I thought it was quiet but not stable. And I asked for 600 million roughly for an economic supplemental, and I got 43. Iraq got the rest. So there's questions of what are you going to do? Is it going to be better? How are you going to, how much time, you know, how are your actions really going to play out? You can't know. I mean, the answers are going to be speculative. And in fact, any answer you make, you have to be willing to keep looking at it and seeing if it holds up, which we don't do very well either. But our default reaction, and I see this in a lot of academic papers too, is you lay out a goal and then you lay out a bunch of actions that go in the direction you want, but without any real serious examination of whether those actions are sufficient to the purpose. Now, I want to go to the moon. I'm going to jump up and down. 50% of my actions go in the right direction. I'm never getting liftoff. It's got to go beyond the fact that the actions go in the right direction. And I don't see us teaching people to think very much in the academic world. Maybe here you guys do it better, but I, by and large, don't see people asking students to think, what are the objections to a policy if once you enunciate it? How likely are you to be able to make this policy work? What are you going to have to put into it? How long will it take? And these are all really hard questions that are much harder than analyzing the problem. So I would start in the halls of academia if you want American leaders to do it better.
I have a segue to a final because I think we're getting near the end here, but
Some of you people probably have
this
classes.
somewhat relates to what you were saying, and that is that when a president looks around to figure out what his options are, or her options are, let's hope in the future, they see a Pentagon with a lot of money and a lot of can-do attitude. And they see a State Department that has been decimated in essence. And one of the roles, a very important role that Ambassador Neumann plays now is as the president of the American Academy for Diplomacy, And I'd like him to say a few words, especially to you young people that might be interested in a career in diplomacy, whether for the United States or for some other country, because it seems to me the world, especially given the nature of the world, we're living with, when I grew up in the 1950s, we had 2.5 billion people or so. Now we have 5.7 billion people on the face of the earth. It's 5 billion more variables for these kinds of decisions. And we need more diplomacy than ever before. And yet when the president turns to see what the options are, it's just too easy to answer Adam Levine's question to say, well, the military is an option. Now, I've had a meeting with some wonderful military fellows earlier today, and I think, they have a real interest in making sure if they're going to get involved in something that it's a mission that they can accomplish. And I do remember President W. Bush saying, really being critical of Clinton for using the military in places, to do nation building. Let's not do that. And then he ends up, of course, in Iraq doing nation building. But talk a little bit about diplomacy, Ron, if you will. In particular, I know you can inspire some of the younger people here to go get into the profession that you and I both cherish.
It's a great profession. Has the drawbacks. Of course, I'm trying to exercise restraint in this opportunity for commercial interruption here. But give me just 1 second, see if I can pose this. But
Thank you very much.
But hang on a sec, hang on.
Oh.
You have big transnational problems, climate, drugs, crime. You have the problem that there are no pure transnational solutions. The action element, despite all the NGOs and everything else, is states. You cannot have any effective action on any of the transnational problems without action by states. You can have action by NGOs and others and all kinds of things. They will not rise to the level you need unless you have action by states. And the fundamental business of diplomacy is to work both in multinational forum and in national to get states to do the things that we think they need to do. And there is a huge need for that. And I'll just leave it there. But the need for diplomacy, the size of the problems that are not just national problems, but that are transnational, is almost a kind of definition of the need for diplomacy.
Maybe we could just take all three really quickly,
Yeah,
briefly,
good.
and then
Okay.
Ambassador Newman. can-
And then we'll
Yeah.
try, please, okay.
You first.
Okay. Hi, everyone. My name is Tanshi, and I'm a sophomore at Brown. And yeah, so I have one question for you. So recently, after the Taliban's attack, there were a lot of Afghanistan citizens fleeing to Europe as refugees. And I just wonder whether it will be a very like a severe issue,
Refugee
consequence.
flows.
Yeah, because European governments, like they learned from their so-called mistake last time, so they don't really want to accept any more refugees.
My name is Beenish Pervez. I'm a PhD candidate in the political science department here at Brown. And my question is related to a little bit looking ahead. The US intelligence pretty much choked the last month's withdrawal talking about a lot. My question is, how does it impact the future of specifically drone strikes in the region? Keeping in mind the recent attack that happened where are there changes being contemplated in these?
Go ahead.
You're talking about drones.
My name is Zhou Tianyu. I came from China, and I'm pretty interested in like the general security order in the Central Asian region, including Afghanistan, like broadly. Like I know that as what you said, there's no question that China wants a very stable Afghanistan for the reason of security. China has already met with Abdul Ghani, which is the second most important person in Taliban. And also the Taliban said to the reporters that they need China's help for recovery. I was just wondering, what would you expect would be the interaction between the Taliban government and China? Because China, as most Islamic parties understood, is an Abdul Ba'id, which is the further enemy, which is a atheist party that people do not want usually, and which is exactly the talking point that many Uyghur activist groups are talking about. So do you think that will backlash into China's ongoing relationship with the Taliban? Secondly, in terms of more general regional stability issues, such as the SCO, the China-Shanghai Cooperation Organization, would you think China's cooperation with Central Asian countries, like the governments, not like the people, but like the governments, and Russia would maintain the current level or trend of cooperation in terms of counterterrorism? And how do you think the US would react to this, like rising order that's centered towards Beijing and Moscow, of course?
Okay, on the first question of refugees, yes, I think there will be more refugees, and I think this really worries and scares the Europeans because most of the refugees, or many of them, will go out through Iran. The Iranians will flush them over toward Turkey, and the Turks will either get a hefty price or will let them move on to Europe. Uh, There are probably 1.5 million or 2 million Afghans outside the country. Now, there were 5 million at the end when we went in, and the population has grown considerably. So there's lots of room for several million more refugees. On the question of intelligence and strikes, it was difficult enough to maintain good, actionable intelligence when you had both troops on the ground, but you also had the base to have all kinds of electronic intelligence and visual intelligence that was mounted out of platforms in Afghanistan. All that has gone away. I know a few senior military people and I know a bunch of former senior people, and I know a few senior special ops people, at the 3 and 4 star level. I know of none who believe that we will adequately handle a counterterrorist mission from over the horizon. I think this is a political fantasy of Washington think tankers and politicians that has no basis in military reality. I think it was best expressed by one former SOCOM commander who said to me, you can do an individual mission, like a hostage rescue. It's harder, it's more dangerous, it's more complicated to mount. You can do a one-off. You cannot have strategic effect. And I think that's the reality. And as a result, we will from time to time do things, and sometimes the intelligence will be good enough and sometimes it won't. But, even when our platforms were there, this is not an exact science. We bombed wedding parties and we killed a lot of innocent people for a lot of reasons, different part. I don't need to go into all the details, but the point is, this is a very hard business to do. It's really hard. And the more, of course, the more you demand exact intelligence, the more you demand exact knowledge of who you're going to strike, the greater the chance that you also don't strike something which then comes back and kills you. So they, this last one, they blew up some poor aid worker who was running gas refill canisters to an NGO. On the other hand, if they hadn't struck it, it turned out that was somebody driving the next bomb to Kabul airport, that might have been a couple hundred people dying there. So you're often going to make these decisions with, even at the best of times, you're going to make them with inadequate information. And sometimes you're going to flat out get them wrong. So it's rough, but it's going to be much, much rougher. On the question of China, and I am no kind of a China expert, but what I would say is, I do not think the Chinese, I see no reason to believe the Chinese will let their religious views or lack of religious views or worries about religion reduce their ability to deal with the Taliban. If the Taliban can produce what the Chinese want, above all, which is control of any movement that might be an insurgent movement going into China. If the Taliban can deliver that, then the Chinese will work with them. I think, on the other hand, that the Taliban are going to be disappointed because the Chinese are not going to put into Afghanistan the level of aid and resources that the West and the United States could. They have not, China's just not big in development financing. They do certain big projects, they do them very well. They'll do some big infrastructure projects. They're talking about picking up the big copper mine that they had won a contract for back several years ago. But the totality of all that is going to be way, way short of what the Taliban need. So I think both sides have a reason to cooperate. The Taliban are likely to be disappointed in the level of assistance they can get from China. And the Chinese may find over time they're disappointed in how well the Taliban can control the insurgents, maybe because they won't have sufficient control of the country. Might not just be about intention. But those are guesses. That's the best I can do.
Well, let us thank our guest. I think you've seen an example here of the best of the Foreign Service of the United States here, and I think it's, yes, sir.
Update on that school.
He asked about the school for girls that Ambassador Neumann has been involved in.
Yeah, I'm on the advisory board. They are very sensitive about how much one puts out public about them, but they have evacuated and they are now temporarily located. I'm trying to remember what Shabana has put out in press about where they are, but they are all temporarily located outside the country, and they are billing that as what do you call it, like a semester abroad. Their intention is still to work for Afghan women. Whether they will ever be able to get back, they would like to go back to Afghanistan someday. But for now, they're looking at how they restructure programs in order to continue educating Afghan women outside the country. Some talk about maybe they'll be drawing more people from the refugee camps. No decision yet. Board meeting coming up. I don't vote the board meeting as I'm on the advisory committee. So they're looking very hard at how best to continue their operation. They did get out a lot of people. And one of the distinguishing things about this school was that the girls come from, I'm trying to remember now, it's over 20 provinces. It's multi-ethnic, picked on a merit base. And one of the amazing things was how many families, and some of these families are not really urban families, they're rural families, how many of these families were prepared to say, yes, take my daughter and get her out of country and continue her education. And this is one of these big changes in Afghanistan, is the number of people who want their girls and their women educated. And this has been going on for years. And I remember when I was ambassador, I was down talking to the governor in one of the eastern provinces, host, I think it was, Gardez. Nice guy, spent years in Australia, came back to help his country, was eventually assassinated. But he was telling me about a delegation of tribal elders, very conservative part of the province. And they came and they said, we have a request. And he said, yeah, well, okay, what is it? And they said, we want a girls' school. And he said, well, that's great. But, I know something about your part of the country. This is really, really conservative. Why do you want a girls' school? And they said to him, because our women are sick. And nobody's ever going to come from outside to treat our women. And if we don't teach our girls to be women who have the knowledge to help us, nobody else will help us. Now that was 2006. So that's one of these seeds I was talking about that, we'll see if it sprouts or whether the ground dries up.
Well, it's rare that a moderator has a hard time ending a program, but you can see this is a testament to this ambassador here that we are having a hard time, because I'm sure there are many more questions, but we do have another event to go to, so I'm going to have to end it. But I want to thank everybody for coming, and let's thank the ambassador for his great remarks.
Great audience, great questions.
Yeah, very good. Good questions. Thank you all.